Greetings in the blessed holy name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you all for listening. This is Matthew Dyer with the Christian American Ministries The AIM webcast. This is going to be episode number 7. And I'm honored to have a good friend on the line here, Pastor Charles Jennings, with me today. And we're going to be discussing Anglo-Israel preachers. And not just Anglo-Israel preachers, but Anglo-Israel preachers throughout history. And proving and discussing the topic of Anglo-Israel not being a new doctrine. There's many people out there that state the incorrect notion that the Anglo-Israel truth is some kind of new doctrine cooked up by a man named Richard Brothers, or some people say it was Herbert W. Armstrong. And we also want to talk about some of the people, famous preachers and evangelists through history, that have adhered to this belief, preached it, believed it, and taught it. And you'll be surprised, if you're not familiar with what we're going to talk about today, you'll be surprised how many people during the 1800s and 1900s that were very well known evangelists and preachers that believed it and taught this message. So how you doing, Pastor Jennings?
Just fine, Matthew, and I thank you very much for having me on for this hour of interesting talk.
It's a pleasure. And Pastor Jennings, he is very familiar with this subject. He's helped me with a lot of this subject because I've wrote on this a couple times and working on more material concerning this rich history of Anglo-Israel. And one book, before we get started, one book I want to recommend to anyone listening is Pastor Jennings has wrote a book called Who Hath Believed Our Report? And you can get this book at his website, truthinhistory.com, and truthinhistory.org. And it is an excellent book of just a small fraction of the material, compiled material by some of these famous men we're going to talk about in their writings on this subject. Pastor Jennings, how long, with that book, Who Hath Believed Your Report, could you tell us kind of what got you interested in the topic of this history and kind of how long it took you to compile the information in that book?
Well, I'll go back a little ways. I learned this truth when I was a teenager, but I didn't really know what to do with it. But it came to me by what I call divine revelation. So therefore it was hidden in my heart and in my mind all through Bible college and in my early part of my ministry in the denominational church. But I really didn't know exactly what to do with it or how to approach preaching it or teaching it, because I knew that it was always scorned by the denominational world. And in college, naturally, in the course called polemics, the history of the cults, it was really put down pretty hard. But would you believe one student, older student, about 20 years my senior, got up and gave a report on British Israelism. And
interesting.
He actually brought out a lot of points in favor of that topic. So therefore I got acquainted with him and, added to my knowledge. And then in 1976, early 1976, someone gave me a little booklet entitled Tracing the Isaac Sons by C.O. Stadscliffe. And that opened my eyes immediately. It's a real small booklet. But, it just brought everything into focus. And I thought, wow, this has got to be true. So I let my wife read it, and she read it, and her eyes were immediately opened. So thank God we were on the same page. And,
indeed,
so I started teaching it. And I started coming across all these different names of different men that were either familiar with me or halfway familiar because of my study of church history going back 150 years. And I thought, okay, this man believed it. He was a credible preacher or credible evangelist, and he knew so-and-so, and he knew so-and-so. So, hey, I'm going to dig into this a little deeper. Well, as the years rolled by, I met Pastor Southwick. And, he had, his daughter told me he had 6,900 books.
Wow.
Well, I could believe it. And so I got to talking to him, and he mentioned different names that I was familiar with that knew the message and taught the Anglo-Israel message. Well, Brother George was very intelligent. He was very much informed on church history, especially Pentecostal history, because, he was raised, both of us were raised in the Pentecostal church, and everything began to click, and it was just the Holy Spirit that just put it in me, hey, do research, with Brother George's help, and he would send me little tracts and so forth and give me names, and I began to research. And it took me, I don't know how long it took to compile this book, but I'll say 2 or 3 years. So, therefore, this is not only this book, but the names that you are compiling is a witness to the validity of this truth, because really there's some great men of God that have gone on that believe this truth. And therefore, it would pay for every evangelical fundamental Christian to lay aside their prejudice and say, hey, I want to hear the words of the testimonies of the men of the past. Because, everything we know, we have learned from men of the past or men of the present. So it just kind of fell into place. This book just fell into place. And, you're finding more names than I have in this book with the use of the computer and so forth. But some of the great men of God, this country has had a wonderful religious history, starting with the First Great Awakening, the preaching of George Whitefield, when he preached from Maine to Georgia, going up and down the coast. And I think he came over to this country, I heard one time he came over here like 17 different times. Preaching. Oh, wow. And he not only preached the gospel, thousands were converted. He even informed our founding fathers that wrote the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and so forth. He informed them concerning the purposes of God in this nation. He was a very wise but yet young man. And then the spiritual awakening of First Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards coming this way, Second Great Awakening, and then the revivals that took place in the 1850s, like the Fulton Street Revival in New York, the revival in the Confederate Army, the revival, the old Methodist camp meetings in the Deep South, from all the way from Texas to South Carolina.
Oh yes.
And then the Pentecostal revival of 1900, other revivals coming this way, latter rain revival. God has raised up many wonderful men. But, in compiling this book and doing the research, I'll have to say that I went to the Assemblies of God headquarters in Springfield, Missouri. I knew that some Assemblies of God ministers had believed this. Well, I had been licensed with the Assemblies of God for 10 years. And when I went to their archive, and I gave the researcher, the staff member there, some names to look up and bring their material for I can look it over. The director of the archive came to me, the man that you met, came to me and said, you know, I know what you're looking for. You're looking for material of men that believe the Anglo-Israel message. He said, I'm a church historian. But he said, I could not find this material. I guess he was looking in the wrong place. But
Indeed.
He said, the church historians that wrote Pentecostal history have left out. They did a good job at what they did, but they left out this part of it. So there's a real big gap in the history, and I want you to fill in that gap. Well, this is where the book came in. And he actually helped find men and material that contributed to this book, even though I'm not saying he's a believer in it.
Yes.
But he's a historian. He's a church historian. And he knows that many men in the denominational world believed the Anglo-Israel message. And
indeed.
And Matthew, I am convinced that there have been hundreds, thousands that believe this message that never left any documentary proof. It's like men who believe in the virgin birth of Christ, but they never left a sermon. There's never a written sermon on their belief in that, but it doesn't mean that they didn't believe it. It's just that they didn't leave documentation. Same with this. I'm convinced that many of them believed, but did not leave documentation. So when people say, "Oh well, that Anglo-Israelism or British Israelism or quote Armstrongism," that's their derogatory term for it. It's nothing but a cult. No, it's not a cult. It's like George Southwick said, we are Bible-believing, Christ-centered believers in the gospel. We believe in salvation by grace. We believe in the work of the Holy Spirit. We believe in a holy life. We believe in the second coming of Christ. We believe in the headship of Christ over his church and over his kingdom, and etc. But where we differ is in mainly 2 points: history and prophecy. And if you know your Old Testament history, you know that God dealt with a people named Israel, starting with Abraham, Genesis 12, Isaac, Jacob, Israel, and then the 12 sons. God dealt with that family line. And a man would have to be blind, deaf, and dumb if he could not see that when he reads the Bible. So, so when God dealt with this family, Israel, he made all these promises, many promises. And he said, you have failed in keeping these promises. He told Israel, you failed. Long story made short, you failed. I'm going to divorce you. And so they were divorced. He put them away. He allowed the Assyrian Empire to conduct 7 different invasions into northern Israel and finally deport them into Assyria. And he said, but I have not given up on you. I have not given up on you. Because what God swore, he swore to keep his word. And he said to Israel, he said, I will give you 7 witnesses that you will always exist in the earth. And when he said to Israel, he was talking to a specific, genetic, visible, physical people, not the church.
Amen.
That's replacement theology, not the church. But he said, I will keep my word to you, even though I have divorced you. He says, I will make a new covenant with not the church, but the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And that word house means family. The family
Amen.
of Israel and the family of Judah. And that was Jeremiah 31. And then the writer of Hebrews confirms that. That is the Christian covenant. And that's found in Hebrews chapter 8. You know, so it's here.
Amen.
Visible, physical Israel is here. And when those deportations of Assyria, of Israel, was put in the Assyrian Empire, in about 100 years, that empire collapsed because Babylon was on the rise and Assyria was on the decline, and Israel, the people of Israel that were captive, actually all 13 tribes, they left. They left, and they did not go back to Palestine. I don't care what doctorate some man has that says they went back. There's no proof, no biblical or secular proof. They went north and west.
Isn't.
And they went to northwestern Europe, the British Isles, and we know the history of northwestern Europe, British Isles, and America, and how God has dealt with us. We are Israel, without any shadow of a doubt. Well, I don't want to do all the talking here, but
no, absolutely no. I was just listening to you because you have a lot of knowledge on this subject. Everything you just said is something that is just the very short introduction you gave there concerning the Israelites and the promises is theology that is absolutely foreign to most Christians, unfortunately.
Yes.
And it's stuff that's not taught very regularly. And that is something new. I mean, that is something that has just happened recently because some of the men we're going to discuss is, they understood this. People like F.F. Bosworth,
yes.
he believed the Anglo-Israel message and wrote about it. And you, in fact, in your book here, Who Hath Believed Our Report, you have a chapter in here with some of his writings on the subject.
Yes.
And some of the listeners that are listening, they may be familiar with F.F. Bosworth. If they're not, I'd recommend you look him up. But he wrote the book Christ the Healer.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that book's still very popular today, and
it is.
You could probably find it in most Christian bookstores, maybe. I'm not sure, but he believed it, he taught it, and he was associated with a lot of different men that were familiar with the doctrine, and one of them being Howard Rand, which some of my listeners may be familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
Howard Rand and F.F. Bosworth were friends, and Howard Rand Bosworth even handed over his microphone to his weekly radio show to Howard Rand once a week to promote Howard Rand's Anglo-Saxon Federation. Now, that would have been in the 1930s.
Yes.
And so there was a neat little connection there between those two men. But going even farther back, as you state in your book, F.F. Bosworth was associated with a lot of the men that came out of Zion, Illinois, which with John Alexander Dowie, and he was also a believer in the message. And,
oh, yeah. Strong believer.
you even did a documentary on him, did you not?
Yes, I did. That man, we could talk 2 or 3 hours just on that one man, but
yes.
he had such an influence in an impact into the Christian world around 1890 till his death in 1907. And out of his ministry, out of Zion, Illinois, he actually built not a church only, but a city. And his concept was the restoration of the kingdom of God on earth. And he knew who Israel truly was. And out of that came F.F. Bosworth. Another evangelist was a man by the name of Raymond T. Ritchie, and his father E.N. Ritchie, who became national evangelists all the way through the late 1960s. And churches were born out of that man's ministry, but he was such a worker and such a shaker and mover, that many men, out of Zion came the teaching, one of the great teaching of the Anglo-Israel message, and also John G. Lake came out of there. Now, maybe some folks have read his book concerning his ministry, healing ministry, salvation meetings, and also, great evangelistic campaigns. There's a number of men that came out of there. But before him, were men in Great Britain. In the ministry of Stephen and George Jeffreys, two of the greatest evangelists that Britain ever produced, they came out of the Welsh revival. They were saved and converted out of the Welsh revival. And they believed this. And George Jeffreys, he said there's 3 schools of thought: the Jewish Israel concept, the Church Israel, and Anglo-Israel. And he said, I adhere to the Anglo-Israel concept of the Bible interpretation. As you know as well as, men in this country that, a lot of these men we never heard of.
Indeed.
They were men that were evangelists, etc. One of them was Clem Davies. Another, I might say this. During the 1920s, following World War I, the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, between the 2 wars, there were a lot of evangelism going on in America. A lot of Baptist, Methodist, and Assemblies of God, Church of God, Pentecostal preachers going on. And, they were obscure. They were men that we don't hear about. They weren't Billy Grahams, so to speak. But like Matthew Eshelman, he belonged to the Church of the Brethren, but he wrote a book entitled 2 Sticks of the Lost Tribes of Israel Discovered. And
you have a portion of that book in your book, correct?
Yes, I do. And he shows that he believed it. Well, Church of the Brethren. Well, most people, maybe not even heard of the Church of the Brethren. And Henry Wellington Stowe, He was quite a preacher. He was friends. He had some sons. They also believed. They were basically Baptist, and he was actually a friend of Dwight L. Moody.
Oh, wow.
He met Dwight L. Moody when he was a young man. Well, Henry Stow was personal friends with William Jennings Bryan, the great orator, politician, etc. And then we have W.B. Record, Warren Bruce Record, who was Robert Record's father.
Mm-hmm.
He and his son Robert were on the radio preaching this for 62 years.
What state were they out of?
61 years. California, mainly. And then Clem Davies. And then Lincoln Mcconnell. Well, who's ever heard of Lincoln Mcconnell, But he pastored the People's Church of Atlanta. 2,000 people in attendance. This was in the 1920s. And the seating capacity of the church was 4,000.
Oh, wow.
And it was filled practically every Sunday to come to hear him preach. These were men that believed the Anglo-Israel message. Another man, George B. Peck.
Mm-hmm.
See, George Peck, who was a medical doctor, he was a friend of A.B. Simpson. Well, A.B. Simpson was a man, he started the Christian and Missionary Alliance Church, which is still going today, very strong.
Yes, it is.
And Dr. Peck knew him and believed the Israel message. Well, no doubt that he shared this message with A.B. Simpson, So J.C. Kellogg. J.C. Kellogg was he was kind of a cowboy preacher, dressed as a Western cowboy, and he produced a booklet entitled "The United States in Prophecy." And so there's many witnesses on our side. Here's another man go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, a lot of these men that you're mentioning, they may not mean anything to most people today, but many of them, maybe not nationwide, but maybe in, their respected areas, were very well known.
Oh, yes.
And, today, many of our people are very ignorant to history anyway, so many of these famous evangelists and during the 18 and 1900s, we don't hear about them because most people don't read about them.
That's right.
And you were talking about the records being on the radio for 60 years. One thing that you will find with the Anglo-Israel message is many people that preached it were on the radio pretty early.
Oh, yeah.
And I believe the first commercial radio station came online around 1921. Mm-hmm. And Daniel Rader, who was a brother to Luke Rader, which are two big-time evangelists during their day, during the early 1900s, he preached on the radio for the very first time in 1921. And, 1922, June 3rd, 1922. He was invited by the mayor of the city of Chicago to preach a sermon on the city's new radio station. The call sign was WBU, and it was on the rooftop of the town hall. Yeah. And at the time, it was just a makeshift little shack they had put together with some plywood, and they invited him up there to preach a sermon, and he believed the Anglo-Israel message, and him and his brother, both of them.
Yeah.
And Luke Rader, now Daniel Rader wasn't much of a writer, but both of them believed the Anglo-Israel message. But Luke Rader wrote a little tract called, or a little booklet called The Lost Key to the Old Testament Found. And you actually have that in your book.
Yes.
And Daniel Rader, after he had preached that sermon on the radio station there in Chicago, the mayor that owned the radio station after that signed a contract with him in 1925, and they had regular radio broadcasts there in Chicago and signed a contract to provide 15 hours of preaching programming for the next 10 years on that radio station, and that was in 1925. And another one, we were talking about F.F. Bosworth. Of course, he was on in the 30s, and Howard Rand was on the radio as well, and so was, can't place his name. I lost it. But go ahead with what you were saying. I apologize.
Well, that's okay. Luke Rader, in his church, River Lake Gospel Tabernacle,
yes,
Minneapolis, he was very influential. I mean, during the 30s, he died in, I think, 1952. So he was real influential during the 30s and the 40s. So I think he built his church in 1928. So for a good 20 years, he preached the Anglo-Israel message. And in his church, as guest speakers, he had George Bennard, the man who wrote the song, The Old Rugged Cross. He had Billy Sunday's widow. He had Mordecai Ham. He had all the top names coming through his church. And see, it was an acceptable thing with the evangelical people, with evangelical preachers. It was the acceptable thing, even though maybe some of them didn't fully understand it. They knew that these men were Christian, that believed it. And it's amazing the connections that these men had with one another, because it was, we living today, we seem to have a very narrow area of fellowship. We don't see the big picture that took place during the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, when so many of these men believed it. Well, Mordecai Ham, we'll jump on him a little bit.
Of course.
Mordecai Ham was a Baptist preacher from Kentucky. He believed it, and holding a revival in Charlotte, North Carolina, 1934-35. And guess who attended his meetings? Billy Graham and his friend Grady Wilson. And both of them answered the altar call, and they were converted under the ministry of Mordecai Ham, a preacher of Anglo-Israel truth. So this thing was not done in a corner.
No.
This truth was not done in a quarter. I met, about 2 years before the man died, I met a man by the name of Clement Humbard. That was Rex Humbard's brother. Rex Humbard, as you well know, was on television, I guess, for decades out of Ohio, and he had that big church, I think it was called the Cathedral of Tomorrow or something like that. Very influential. And he's the man, Rex Humbard is the man that actually went and prayed with Elvis Presley. But Clement, his younger brother, I met Clement about 2 years before he died. And this is what Clement told me, because Clement was a believer in the Anglo-Israel message. And I asked him, I said, Clement, you're 89 years old, you go back a long ways. How many preachers do you know? Because your family, the Humbard family, Matthew, was very, very influential. Mm-hmm. They were a musical family. They were on the radio. You might even do research on this family. They were on the radio. They were accepted far and wide. I mean, their evangelistic meetings were booked from coast to coast. And so I asked Clement one day, I said, how many of the old-time preachers that you've known ever since, going back as a young man, believe the Anglo-Israel message? He said practically every one of them.
Wow.
Practically every one of them. Because he said what it did, they saw their calling as an Israelite to be a witness to the nations and to preach the gospel. So, his father, A.E. Humbard, was one of the founding fathers of the Assemblies of God. So this goes deep, especially into Pentecostal history, because of Charles Parham, who was buried 110 miles from where I'm sitting, mm-hmm. and he believed it. And he learned it from J.H. Allen, John Hardin Allen, the Methodist bishop.
Yes.
So, I mean, there's connections. There's so many connections that, I mean, it's like a
spider web.
Yeah, like a spider web. I mean, it just goes on and on. And
the
then
man,
some. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I'm talking too much. Go ahead.
The man that I was trying to remember earlier, we were talking, and this is one you're familiar with. We were talking about radio. Was John Lovell, John
yes.
A. Lovell.
Yes.
And he started his radio broadcast, America Awake, in 1932.
Wow.
So there's another 30s, and that's during the new age of radio. Mm-hmm. Radio became a thing in the 20s, more commercially, and then in the 30s it really boomed. And 1932 is very, very early on, and so he was kind of a pioneer. And he had a radio show in Dublin, Texas, between 1932 and 1936. And he was stationed, or he wasn't stationed, but he was out of Dallas, Texas. He pastored the church, First Covenant Church in Dallas, Texas. And he started expanding his radio broadcast after that to some other cities and things like that. But he founded the magazine, The Kingdom Digest, in 1940. And it was published every month from 1940 to, I think it was 2010, 2011. Of course, yes. He passed away in 1979, but it continued being published after he passed away. But he's another one that nobody knows who he is. In fact, you can Google him and find almost anything, nothing on the man. But he was a prolific writer and did radio for years, and he was one of those voices in the wilderness, you could say, on the radio during the 30s and 40s, preaching the Anglo-Israel message, and it just another testament to it. And you were talking about J.H. Allen. Now, he was a man that became very, I was talking to some brethren this morning about how one person can make a difference in the the aspect of maybe millions of people's lives. And this is one man that did just that. He was a Methodist minister, but he wrote the book Judas' Scepter and Joseph's Birthright. And although there may be some slight doctrinal issues that over time we've worked out over the ages, but this book, I don't know how many stories that I've read of ministers and just people in general reading this book it was published in 1902, reading this book and coming to this truth from 1902 onwards, even till today. It's still being printed. And it was widely accepted, too, during that time. In fact, the Baptist Messenger, which is a publication that the Baptist Church puts out that's still in print today, wrote this about it, and I think it was the early 19-teens, said this, quote, "This is one of the most interesting volumes we have read in many days, and we confess the arguments produced by Mr. Allen seem to be unanswerable. It is more thrilling than a Western fiction. The description of the scarlet thread, the royal remnant, and the part played by Jeremiah in the preservation of the ruler for David's throne will cause you to lose sleep rather than go to bed without knowing the outcome," end quote.
Yeah.
This was the Baptist Messenger. This is still a publication today. Yeah. And they were pretty much endorsing the book. And those that haven't read the book, it is a outline of the Anglo-Israel truth. And you can actually read it for free online. It's a good book. And like I said, I've read dozens and dozens of people that got his book, and it opened up their eyes to it. And I know a few people personally. That's how they came into it, is reading that book.
Well, there's so many wonderful testimonies that, one interesting character, or should I say interesting man, was Richard Reeder Harris.
Yes,
He was British. He was a prominent English barrister. He was a counselor to Queen Victoria. He was a Methodist minister. And he was the founder of the Pentecostal League of Prayer. And, he died in 1909. But he wrote a book entitled The Lost Tribes of Israel. Well, he was personal friends with Oswald Chambers. And I hope that name rings a bell with a lot of listeners, because Oswald Chambers is the man that wrote My Utmost for His Highest. That's the daily devotional that is so popular and sold in Christian bookstores today. They were personal friends. And when Richard Reeder Harris passed away, Oswald Chambers went to in fact, he helped officiate the funeral for Richard Reeder Harris. So that shows us how widespread this truth was in Great Britain and in North America, not only in the U.S., but also in Canada. And in Toronto, there was a real famous preacher. What was his name? I think his last name was Smith. He pastored the People's Church in Toronto.
Oh, I know who you're talking about, yes.
I think his last name was Smith. I can't remember. But he made the statement. It was a real evangelistic type church. And he said the three greatest revivals, the revival meetings, like a 2-week span of church services, the three greatest revivals ever held in his church were held by Anglo-Israel preachers. and I think Bosworth was one. A.P. Galthy, Adolf Philip Galthy was another one. And I think the other one was Dowie, but I'm not sure about that. But I think he was the third one. All three of those men believed the Anglo-Israel belief, and Dr. Smith knew that. He knew what these men believed, and he still invited them to his pulpit to preach to his people. So this was a widespread thing, and the men who believed it and preached it, they were preachers. They were anointed preachers, Christ-centered, God-ordained men that preached this, and they didn't preach it with any animosity. They preached it in love. They preached it as a Bible fact. And, you know, I really found it interesting as a teenager. A man came our way, and he began to hold meetings around the city, Miami, Florida. Mm-hmm. And his name was William Cathcart.
Yes.
Well, he died in 1988, so I remember him well. I went to many of his meetings.
Didn't he go to Australia?
Yes. He was a Scotsman. And he was in World War I. And he came back home to where he lived in Scotland, a very, very sick young man. He was born in 1893. And he was suffering from the effects of that gas that they used, that the Germans used. Mustard gas on the Allied forces. And he was just, extremely sick. He was ready to die. But somehow he met a group of people. He met a group of people in a little faith mission. And they introduced him to the message of the gospel. And this man not only was healed or saved, became a Christian, he was healed, divinely healed, and was called to the ministry. And he went to Australia under the auspices of the Apostolic Church of Wales. He started 40 churches in Australia, every one of them believing the Anglo-Israel message, because he was taught it before he left Great Britain. So this message has gone far and wide. It has not been hidden in a closet. There's no need for us to be ashamed of this message. And, you know, it was in South Africa. Frederick Neeser believed it. And I wrote to him several times, and he wrote back, but he's passed away now. But, you know, another man that I was trying to think of, you know, what was his name? Maxwell White. Mm-hmm. W-H-Y-T-E. He pastored a church in Toronto, Canada. He was Benny Hinn's first pastor when Benny Hinn came to North America. So do you think maybe Benny Hinn has heard this message?
You know, you were talking about Mordecai Ham earlier. You know, Benny Hinn, Mordecai Ham, all those preachers. You know, we know the connection of Mordecai Ham, you know, knowing and preaching the Anglo-Israel message. And there is significant proof that Billy Graham, at the very least, was shown that truth and then obviously denied it, and or secretly believed it. There's documentation for both, actually. Well, and the same could be for Benny Hinn.
He could have heard it, believed it, but not preach it because of, for financial and reasons and popularity reasons and acceptance reasons. But
absolutely,
when I was doing research for this book, I called Howard B. Rand's ministry.
Yes.
Well, Howard Rand had already passed away, but I talked to a man up there, and I forget his name. But this is what he told me, and he was an older gentleman at the time. He said, my parents and I, as a family, we lived in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. And he said, my father and mother knew Howard Rand way back in those days. And he said, my father and mother also knew Howard Rand when he was in Detroit area with the Anglo-Saxon World Federation.
Yes.
Or the Anglo-Saxon, World Federation. Or Anglo-Saxon Federation of America, I think it was.
Yeah, that's what it was, yes.
But he said, my mother and father, with Howard Rand, met Henry Ford. He said, I didn't meet him, but my parents met him. And they sat down and they told Henry Ford this message. And he said, that sounds good to me. He said, this message sounds good to me, that we are Israel. Well, going back a little later, they were in Minneapolis area. And he said, W.B. Record met with Grady Wilson, Billy Graham's associate, because Billy Graham's headquarters was in Minneapolis for many years. And Grady Wilson was an associate evangelist with Billy Graham. And when Billy Graham couldn't do his radio program, it was Grady Wilson that was on the program, because I've listened to him many times. He said, W.B. Record, that's Robert Record's father, would have lunch with Grady Wilson. They were friends. And he told him this message. And he said, Grady Wilson told W.B. Record, Billy and I both believe this message, but we cannot afford to preach it because Billy is preaching around the world. He said,
and it would have shut him down.
Yes. So, this was widespread. When people say, oh, well, it's just something that somebody came up with, he had some wow-haired dream or something, or it was a cult or something like that. Brother, they don't know what they're talking about.
Amen.
They are totally devoid of facts. They're prejudiced. They won't listen. But this gospel that the Anglo-Saxon people and related people are Israel is the only thing that makes biblical prophetic sense.
Amen.
And, we are Christian. The Lord Jesus established the church. He said, I will build my church, and he built it within the context of a national people called Israel. And it's been the Western world, starting with the British, the German, the Dutch, the Swedes, that began to evangelize the dark world, the third world. And then when America was established early on, we printed Bibles in, how many languages is the Bible been printed in? Do you know?
I do not know. That's a good question. Probably almost all of them, I would think.
Somebody told me somewhere around 167 languages.
Okay, yeah.
Well, who's doing that? Other than
it's not the Japanese.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's nothing against Japanese, but it's just a fact of the world we live in. The majority of the printed Christian material, just look at the Bible, just as one example, is coming out of the Anglo-Saxon countries, and it's been that way for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
In fact, the Anglo-Saxon Christian people are responsible for the first books, period. Now, that could be said for the Gutenberg-style book.
Yes.
But even going back to the 1st and 2nd century, there is a lot of historical evidence showing how the very first codexes, now, before that time, everything was on a scroll.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of textual evidence that prove that the Christians were the ones that first created the codex, the actual book with pages like we see today. And there's a man on YouTube, he's a Greek scholar, wrote a lot on textual history, and James White. And he did a video on how they can look at a scroll and a work and tell whether it was Christian or written by a Judean because of the style of that day. And the codex is almost always Christian sources.
Wow.
And that is just, and then when you move 1,500 years or 1,400 years later, we have Johann Gutenberg, coming up with the typeset press, and of course that there's no coincidence that happened at the time it did, because then we had the Reformation explode.
Right.
at that moment in time. But you were talking about Henry Ford and Howard Rand there, and I have a little bit of more to add to that.
Okay.
Of course, William Cameron, and I can't remember if you mentioned him in your book or not.
I'm not
but
sure.
He wrote a book called The Covenant People, and on the Israel Message. And he was the editor of Henry Ford's newspaper, the Deadborn Press? Deadborn Press? It was Deadborn, Minnesota.
Yeah. Yeah,
that's it. Anyway, he was the editor of Henry Ford's newspaper, and he was a very good writer for the Anglo-Israel movement at that time. He wrote in Destiny magazine. He wrote the book The Covenant People, which is still in print today. And he was the editor for Henry Ford. And I have a book that I ordered. It was a used book I ordered this past year, written by J. Challen. It was one of J. Challen's less popular books that he wrote. And I bought the book mainly for just to have it as a set with his other ones. And when I got the book, and I bought this not knowing it at all, it was a surprise when it got here. When I opened the book up, it had a library leaflet and a stamp on the inside, and at one time it belonged to William Cameron.
Wow.
His name was on the inside. It had a stamp on the inside for the Deadborn Press, which was the newspaper for Henry Ford. So, of course, Henry Ford, there's a lot of people that don't care for him, but there's no doubt that, the story you were talking about, him knowing the message, there's no doubt of that. He had too many people around him that were familiar with it.
Oh, yeah. And, Howard Rand was so versatile in his life. Not only a Bible teacher, but a scientist, an anthropologist. I mean, he had studied so many different areas of science, and he knew a lot of important people. So it's very logical that he would sit down with Henry Ford and William Cameron and others. But, you know, I know our time is going by, but I want to, before we close here,
yes,
you know, I want to just mention again the contribution, the rich contribution that George W. Southwick has made to this truth.
Yes.
Because he kept, quote, everything. Books, magazines, newspaper clippings, pamphlets. He told me some of the best truth comes out of these little pamphlets, you know, these little small articles.
Amen.
He said some of the best truth comes out of there. And see, he kept all that. Well, he was helping me. We would talk 3 and 4 times a week over the phone about this stuff. Here I am writing down, you know, names and stuff as he's talking, and then I would do my best on this end to do research without the computer. Well, a little computer. I'm not computer literate, but my wife helped. But you see, and then when he passed, man, I went through all of his stuff. I mean, boxes of stuff that looked like trash. Then I would find a treasure in there, like Luke Rader's book. And so thank God for a man like Brother George Southwick, who had the foresight, the desire, etc., to keep that material and to see, because, you know, he lived a generation before us. So therefore, he had an affinity with that generation. He had an attachment. I mean, he told me he was there in 1928 with his mother in California when he heard Stephen Jeffries give his testimony of the vision that appeared on his wall, his church wall, when he was preaching in 1914, 1915. He was there. He remembered things like that. So I just want to say thank God for Brother George for what he saved, that we are now reaping the benefits of.
Yeah, he did a great work, and you know, a lot of people don't even know his name, and those that are not familiar with George W. Southwick, I'd encourage you to go to Truth in History's YouTube channel, and there's some videos on there of his material. And I met him when I was probably about 9 or 10 years old the first time, and real good man. He has a lot of material out there and audio material. He didn't write that much, but he preserved so much history and passed it on and let others reap the benefits of it. And there's a lot more history out there to be found too.
Yes.
You know, with the research that I've been doing in this subject here, the more I dig, the more I find. And I have found that it, you know, I've talked about it before. I'm slowly working on a book with the history of the Anglo-Israel truth, being in the preachers and the adherents that believed it and taught it. And I have not run out of material to look for. I keep on finding more and more material. When I first, you know, started looking into the subject, you know, I knew it was a lot of material out there, but I keep digging and digging and keep finding more and more.
Yes.
And the reason, now some people may be wondering, if they're listening, they may be wondering, what's the big deal? I mean, who cares what this preacher 200 years ago was preaching? And the reason it's important is it's a testimony that this truth is not something that some weirdo made up in 1840 or whatever.
That's right.
It is a testimony that this truth has been around for a long time.
Yeah.
And I know we mainly spoke about people in the 18 and 1900s, but for those listening, if you want to go to my website, ChristianAmericanMinistries.org, I have a article there, that article and a small trifold tract that I've wrote. The article is expanded a little bit from the tract, but it is a kind of a brief proof of the Anglo-Israel message being preached, and being known in the 500s and the 1300s and 15, 16, 1700s. For example, Jacob Abadai in the 1600s wrote a book, The Triumph and Providence of Religion.
Yes.
And in that book, and you and I have spoke about him several times, he identifies the Anglo-Saxon people with the Israelites.
Yes.
And then there's another one in the 1600s as well. John Sadler, he wrote a book on the kingdom or customs of our ancestors. And although that book wasn't just about the Israel people, in that book he identifies and associates the English people and their kindred nations with an Israelite origin.
Yeah.
And then in 1590, French Huguenot Lee Loyard, I think I pronounced that right, wrote the book The 10 Lost Tribes Found in 1590. And then it just keeps on going back farther and farther. And then what we have to understand is just because not everyone wrote down everything they believed.
That's right.
And then if they did, it doesn't mean it was preserved through history.
Right.
So I found several preachers going through like old newspaper articles, and because there's a lot of websites out there, you can go through old newspaper articles going back 100, 200 years, 300 years, and every now and then I'll find a guy that I've never heard of, don't know who he is, but there was something in there to indicate that he was associated with the Israel message, or he wrote something on it. One instance was a sermon that was published in a newspaper in 1775 by a Reverend William Smith. And in that sermon, he spoke about the American English people being of British Israel. And that's in 1775. And he was the head of what would be known as the Philadelphia College there. He was the head of that college, and that was a man I never heard of, never wrote anything about, but I just happened upon his testimony there, or a little nugget of proof. So there's so many different people out there, and we could talk for days on all these different men, but I appreciate you coming on with me and discussing this, and I want to recommend everybody once again, if they want to learn more about this history, get Pastor Charles Jennings' book, Who Hath Believed Our Report, at his website, truthandhistory.org. And it's really, it's 400 and almost 500 pages of documentation. And I know you've told me, and I've found out myself, you only scratched the surface on the subject.
Oh, yeah.
And there's so much more to be found.
Yeah. The bottom line, Brother Matthew, is that God is faithful to keep his promises.
Amen.
It's the message is not about us. It's about the Lord. And it's about Christ. And when the Lord said, Israel, I have engraven you on the palm of my hand, that's just what he meant. And he said, I will redeem you, and Christ came as our Redeemer. Who are the Christian nations? Who's the, one quick story, and I'll make this
Go
clear.
right ahead.
Years ago, 25, 30 years ago, we were at a small church, and we were thinking about opening a church school. So somebody recommended that I go see the principal of a big Christian school, very successful Christian school in Oklahoma City. So I went and talked to the principal. It was very cordial, and he said to me, I want to tell you what I call the chain of Christianity, starting from Jerusalem and how the gospel came west to us. He did a magnificent story. I mean, he did a magnificent job, how the gospel came all the way to us. Why didn't he trace it to China or Borneo or the North Pole? No, he traced it right to Europe, first Southern Europe, Northern Europe, British Isles, America. And when he finished, I said, do you know the significance of why it came this route? And he looked at me and he said, I don't know. I don't know why it came this route. And I thought to myself, he has all this knowledge, but he doesn't have the key. So I figured, here's my chance. So I told him the gospel was promised to Israel. That's why it came west, because we are the Israel of God. And he looked at me like I just fell off the turnip wagon.
But it's right in front of him.
Yeah, I mean, he told me the story, but he didn't have the key. You know what I mean?
A lot of people will associate this doctrine with a message of racial superior race.
Yeah.
And that's not the case. It is not a message of racial superiority, but rather a message of a superior responsibility racially.
How true.
The Israel people are not superior in race the way this message is often misrepresented. They have a superior responsibility given to them from the Lord to be the servant. You could call them a servant race, whatever you want to call it, to be the servants of the Lord. And they have that responsibility, a bigger responsibility racially. And they, without even knowing it, the majority of them, without even knowing it, they are the ones that have blessed the world in so many ways. Yes, we're not perfect. Nobody is. And not saying the Anglo-Saxon race is sinless. That's not what I'm saying. But the message of this is God keeps his promises. When he said the Israel people would be a multitude of nations, they became a multitude of nations.
That's right.
And when it said they would, the Israel family would be a blessing to all the nations of the earth, they were a blessing to all the nations of the earth.
That's right.
And if we don't believe those very, very young promises, that was all the way back in Genesis 12 and 17. If we don't believe God kept his promises back then there's no reason we should believe that he kept any other promises. And that's what the real meat and potatoes is of this message that people misunderstand.
Yeah. That's it.
Well, Pastor Jennings, I want you to real quick give your website and you also have a YouTube channel as well. And if anyone wants to find you, how to find you?
Well, truthandhistory.org, and on the YouTube, just type in Truth and History, and it'll come up. Also, we have several hundred of Pastor George's audio sermons. Now, you might tell how to find that, Brother Matthew.
I will put a link in the description below to how to locate those. And you can go listen to some of his material. And if you listen to any of his material for any length of time, he's going to mention a lot of the material that we mentioned today, plus a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah.
And he was very well read and very intelligent man. And I'll put all of Pastor Jennings' links and way to find his material below as well. And real quick before you go, also want to mention your magazine. You do a quarterly magazine, Truth in History, as well.
Yes. Well, basically 3 times a year.
3 times a year.
And the subscription is free. If someone would like to receive it, just contact us and we'll send it to you free.
Absolutely. And you can do that through his website. Under the book section, it says magazine subscription, and you can subscribe to that. And even underneath that, he has past issues that you can read too. And it's a very quality publication, really, really good material. And it's been a blessing to me for many years. And I'd encourage anybody listening to go check out his website. And I appreciate you coming on, Pastor Jennings. And I know we only scratched the surface, but maybe that we can wet everybody's whistle on this subject and have them go dig into more material on it.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for having me, Brother Matthew. I appreciate it very much.
My pleasure. If you want to hang on the line for just a second, and everybody listening, thank you for listening to another episode of the AIM webcast. This is going to be episode number 7. And Lord willing, we'll have episode number 8 out sometime next week. And thank you all for listening and supporting, and continue to subscribe to all our channels and outlets and everything. It does make a difference, and I've been encouraged by some of the emails and comments that I've received, and I just thank you all for participating, and it has been a blessing. So until next time, thank you all, and we'll see you then.